We've said this before, we don't make money off of this channel. We probably never will, but that's okay because that means we could be uncensored. But that doesn't mean we're going to not try to get a few sponsors.
Yeah.
So if you're asking yourself, why is there a pumpkin right in the middle of our shot here? It's actually because we're going to try out for some sponsors, see if they like us, if they hook us up with a little cash, a little money, a little cheddar, as they say on the streets. I'm hip like that.
Yep,
but anyway,
hip hop, as they say.
We're gonna try it out, man. We're gonna see. Maybe the sponsors will see this and they'll go, oh, we like those guys.
Those guys are good.
So let's try this out, man. Here we go. This episode is brought to you by off-colored pumpkins because we're so cheap we can't even get the orange ones.
Pumpkins. They're all right.
This episode is brought to you by off-colored pumpkins. Why?
This episode is brought to you by white pumpkins, the clearly superior pumpkin. This episode is brought to you by Michael Jackson's pumpkin. This episode is brought to you by genetically engineered pumpkins. This was a waste of time.
This episode is brought to you by genetically engineered pumpkins. Oh, man. It's not good.
This episode is brought to you by white pumpkins, God's mistake.
This episode is brought to you by white pumpkins, destined to be slam dunked into trash cans.
This episode is brought to you by pumpkins. They stink. This episode is brought to you by white pumpkins. Why does it have to be white? This episode is brought to you by white pumpkins, soon to be made into black pumpkins by Marvel.
This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch, cheap-ass Captain Crunch.
This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch. I forgot the name, had to look at the camera. This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch, Captain Crunch's retarded cousin.
This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch. Smells great, tastes like shit. This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch, Diabetes Sack Edition. This episode is brought to you by Berry Colossal Crunch, killing Ralphie May since yesterday.
You're fat, you're cheap, here's Berry Colossal Crunch for you.
This episode is brought to you by bananas, replacement dicks. This episode is brought to you by bananas. They look like they can go in your ass easy, but they really don't. This episode is brought to you by bananas, collecting fruit flies since, now.
This episode is brought to you by bananas. Harry Belafonte made a song about them. A beautiful bunch of ripe banana.
This episode is brought to you by tree dicks.
This episode is brought to you by simian meat.
This episode is brought to you by bananas, tripping cartoons since the 1920s. This episode is brought to you by bananas, the preferred fruit of all apes. This episode is brought to you by bananas. Where was a big-ass banana when King Kong was around? This episode is brought to you by strawberry frosted mini wheats. You think they're good, but they're not. This episode is brought to you by frosted mini wheats. Painful pillows. This episode is brought to you by frosted mini wheats. Sentient cereal. This episode is brought to you by frosted mini wheats. Beetle dung guy. Enough said.
This episode is brought to you by mini wheats. It's about 90% chemicals.
This episode is brought to you by frosted mini wheats. Hurts going in, hurts coming out. This episode is brought to you by Kellogg's Frosted Mini Wheats. Abraham Lincoln liked them?
This episode is brought to you by Frosted Mini Wheats.
Cracking voices since just now.
Yep. This episode is brought to you by Frosted Mini Wheats. Technically food. This episode is brought to you by Frosted Mini Wheats. A waste of $5.
This episode is brought to you by Cereal Box Makers of America. Definitely not Frosted Mini Wheats. This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. You thought the cake sucked. This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. Better than painful anal.
God. What the hell?
This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. The red is chemicals, the velvet, you don't want to know. This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. Hey Ma, can we try these? Regret.
This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. Soon to be in the clearance aisle near you. This episode is brought to you by Red Velvet Chips Ahoy. Haven't tasted it, already hate it.
Episode is brought to you by Slam Crate. Bunch of crap in a box.
This episode is brought to you by Riverdale, making Archie not suck.
This episode is brought to you by Floss. Blindfolds for Chinese people.
God damn.
That's actually an Andrew Dice Clay joke, so I shouldn't fucking use. That's right, that's why I shouldn't use
Yeah,
it.
that's why.
This episode is brought to you by Bags and Boards for fucking Comics. Who makes them? God knows, but they're sponsoring us.
Apparently. Not getting any money from it, though.
This episode is brought to you by the United States Postal Service. In case you're looking for your grandma, that's where she's working.
This episode is brought to you by the Bible. Don't know who's paying us, don't care.
This episode is brought to you by Cherry Blossom Spray. Just gonna go ahead and say it. Size of a wang. This episode is brought to you by Slimer. Apparently you're fat in the afterlife too, so we're fucked.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by the Bible, the only thing besides cum that is consistently in every hotel room in America. So here you have it, folks. Some of our attempts to, bring in the cash from some big investors. Hopefully they're listening. Hopefully they're going, hey, those guys might help us move some units. Literally like that, because they're from like the fucking 30s.
Yeah, listen here, see, I got some cheese for ya.
And, hey, look, we've established that we got the 20s and 30s crowd, and I don't mean the age demographic.
No,
I mean
literally the people who are dead right now.
so we're good. Ghosts.
Yeah.
I mean, we got them. But anyway, tell us what you think. Are any of these a hit?
Or the shit.
Or they shit. That's a tie-in to our other series, so that's weird. But anyway, this has been Ahab and the Goon Tick. Like, share, and subscribe.
Don't forget to buy your cheese at the $10 Slimer shop. Coming never.
Official $10 Slimer cheese.